My last few videos have been on Alain de Benoist, but I have refrained from giving much of my opinions on him. I mostly wanted to just present his thought without comment because there is much value to glean from his works, but now that I've read pretty much everything that's been translated into English, maybe it's time to reveal where I stand on him. His critiques of liberalism go much deeper than we are used to, as typically right-wing critics focus on the illusory nature of modern democracy. Benoist, on the other hand, promotes not only an alternative democratic vision, but also what amounts to a revolutionary vision against liberalism, which is part of the source of his affinity for left-wing authors and movements. As he reminds us in The Populist Moment, or The Populist Movement, I can't tell which title the book actually has because it's different on the spine than it is on the cover, he believes that the left-right dichotomy is today mostly outmoded due to an elite consensus, and also because populists of the left and right both have a common enemy, the market and the liberals. My overall opinion on Benoist is that he is one of the most innovative and interesting right-wing thinkers in recent time. It's quite a shame that the only people who take interest in his writings in the Anglosphere are left-wing so-called political scientists who are only interested in smearing his doctrine as neo-fascism. I read one of these papers, the one by Daniel Ruda, and the criterion by which the author concluded that Benoist was a neo-fascist was that in his works there is the presence of quote-unquote ultranationalism and a quote movement of national rebirth. By that criteria, both paleoconservatism and monarchism would be fascism. If your criteria for determining whether right-wing movements are fascist is so broad that it could include at once Muller Vanderbroek, Patrick Buchanan, and Clemens von Metternich, is completely useless. All the more proof that credentialism is just a bourgeois conceit. I must also note the absurdity of calling Benoist an ultranationalist who argues for national rebirth. He is a communitarian who advocates for a federalized imperial state, which might be multi-ethnic in the sense of a United States of Europe. In other words, not a nation state. He has in his works criticized the concept of the nation state more directly. How can he be an ultranationalist if he disagrees with the nation state? The most absurd argument made was that Benoist must be a fascist because he drew from conservative interwar authors who the Nazis also drew from. We all know that Hitler drank a glass of water and loved animals too. And for good measure, let's throw in some, he cited Carl Schmitt, so he must be a fascist. This criterion would render a good 50% of the field of political science fascist, considering how wide Schmitt's influence has been, even in the liberal world. Further, the author argues that Benoist matches Griffin's minimal criteria for fascism, which is ultranationalism combined with revisionist Marxism. But as I've said, Benoist is not a nationalist, and he more or less agrees with the leftist Jean-Claude Michéa that Marx perverted socialism, which isn't really a revisionist attitude, more than it is a rejection of him. As far as his critical value theory, or the critical value theory of the magazine Crisis is concerned, it is less so a revision of Marx than it is just a straight-up rejection of his point of view. We also see later that Benoist does not seem to agree with socialism in general, and is decidedly not a Marxist. But all that aside, let's get into some of the problems I have with Benoist before I discuss what some of the important takeaways are from his work. The first disagreement I have with Benoist is regarding the nature of human identity and ethnocentrism. Benoist thinks that identity forms in relation to the other, and as such, the right to cultural and communitarian exclusivity originates from a recognition of the necessity of preserving such differences. This view is understandable in certain regions of today's pluralistic and multiracial societies, where people of different ethnicities, religions, cultures, and races come into contact with one another. But in areas that are mostly ethnically homogeneous, on what basis is there to draw identity? It could not be from the other, since one does not have contact with the other. Instead, one must form one's identity based on proximity. If we imagine how a baby learns to identify his mother, he is not cognizant of the difference between his mother and other women. Instead, he recognizes that his mother is the one who has most frequent contact with him. So in other words, he recognizes his mother through proximity. Benoist's view is perhaps formed by his experience in France, which has been absolutely swamped with immigrants. His concept can only have relevance in the boundary regions of an ethnicity, But in the heartland of his empire, identity must be foundational on the basis of similarity. Benoist aims to critique both ethnocentrism and pluralism. He views ethnocentrism as the logic of individualism applied to the ethnicity as a whole, which leads to domination and violence against the other, as well as homogenization. In this view, it's a kind of group egoism where self-interest is attributed to the group and the legitimacy of all difference is thus denied. Pluralism is similar in outcome insofar as it promotes mixing, and mixing promotes homogeneity rather than difference. Differentialism is supposed to be a way to cut through both tendencies toward this homogeneity and sameness so as to guarantee difference in the world. It is an admirable and intelligent attempt, but it simply does not describe the real way we come to racial consciousness. The more people are immersed in a pluralistic world and its values, the less they seem to recognize themselves as distinct people despite the existence of differences. It is only in enclaves where similar people share the same culture, race, and beliefs where we see genuine racial consciousness arise and persist. This is especially true in immigrant communities. In other words, contact with the other can cause one to feel himself as an other with respect to his own people. We see this all the time when white liberals verbally remove themselves from the category of white oppressor. It is also why we see white people increasingly devoid of racial consciousness, while immigrants exhibit it to a high degree. Reality works in the opposite direction to Benoist's thesis. Moreover, Benoist has an incorrect view of ethnocentrism, which is possibly born out of a desire to distance himself from fascism as much as possible, as well as to skirt French hate speech laws. Although ethnocentrism was not invented in the 20th century, it is just an innate behavior that we have gained through group selection, and which today is rigorously suppressed through social mechanisms. As such, it has no necessary relation to liberal or fascist egoism. The result of contact with the other cannot create the spark of the recognition of similarity, which Benoist says is the corollary of difference, if we consider that we exist in pluralistic conditions. It is ironically the presence of the other that makes it more difficult for native whites to form racial consciousness, because they are too concerned with compromising with others' identities, which is almost required if we are to accept differentialism and Benoist's cultural relativism. Because to assert Western culture in a space filled with non-Western people is to perform a hegemonic act. It is admirable to try to take the spirit of domination out of ethnic solidarity, but I don't think that a will to dominate is an intrinsic part of ethnocentrism. In other words, I think rejecting ethnocentrism is something of a knee-jerk reaction. Besides, ethnocentrism is not a constructed social phenomenon that one can simply argue against. It's just a given that can either be suppressed or unleashed. Repressing it, even for the sake of promoting a relativistic sense of mosaical self-identity, tends to lead to the aforementioned tendency toward compromise and against racial consciousness. In other words, I disagree with Benoist that identity is entirely constructed. There are biological and perhaps spiritual origins of identity. But really, ethnocentrism isn't as cynical as Benoist makes it out to be. Certain formulations of it that are commonly expressed in right-wing circles do reek of an implicit liberalism and an explicit domination, but ethnocentrism pre-existed liberal conceptions of egoism, as I've already said. Ethnocentrism represents, if we want to view it in the best light possible, simply the existence of love for those related to oneself. It enables trust and altruism for a similar reason to Benoist's communitarianism, i.e., it forms a basis for trust and reciprocal obligation based on organic bonds. One of the major reasons why evolutionary theorists believe that ethnocentrism was adaptive is because of this reinforcement of altruism, which allowed ethnocentric groups to outcompete non-ethnocentric groups. It has a predisposition neither toward good nor evil, just as Benoist says for the concept of freedom. We can make either good or bad use of ethnocentrism, depending on the degree to which supremacy is rejected in favor of solidarity. To argue that ethnocentrism necessarily leads to domination and egoism is to argue also that the family is a necessarily egoistic unit, since the dynamics of the family are similar to those of ethnocentrism, and also because the sense of the family does not arise primarily as a result of the other. Furthermore, identity in the ethnocentrist sense does not originate out of alterity, or the difference between the self and the other. It originates out of the recognition of common inheritance. We do not realize that we are part of a family by witnessing other families, but instead by realizing the common love and obligation we have to those in relational proximity to us. One could say that families rely on incorporating the other, but this only happens insofar as the other in question is similar in qualities to the family. The other difference relation does not factor into the family. Basically, Benoist just gets the origin of ethnic identity wrong. Of course, he is correct that the respect for difference is essential, but as he himself says, difference is just the corollary to similarity. In other words, we can invert Benoist's argument based on his own principles. It isn't so much that we recognize our group through the other, but rather we recognize the other in relation to our group. In other words, we recognize difference through relative similarities. It does not necessitate that we argue that our group is better or that we have a right to domination. We can easily argue that for mutual respect on this basis as well, because we arrive at a universal, i.e., people should have a right to exclusive groups on the basis of our own exclusive group. People have a right to be similar to their group because we are similar to our group. Putting the emphasis of identity on similarity rather than on difference does not substantially alter the rest of Benoist's thesis, but it does have the effect of better matching the experience of racial consciousness. And something I also want to point out is that Benoist says that the I cannot form in relation to only oneself, but it has to form within the context of something, namely our relation to our own group. And if the I forms in relation to our own group, then how can it form in relation to the other? Or at least start by forming in relation to the other. What Benoist misses is that the central argument of liberal pluralism is not necessarily a denial of difference, but rather a denial that members of an ethnicity do not have anything in common with other members of the same ethnicity. In other words, the similarity that whites have with each other is just reduced to the construct whiteness, for example. We are reduced to individuals without collective similarity. Our similarities are reduced to accidents or choices, and the only legitimate similarities left over are what all humans share in common, which is completely banal. If we recognize that members of our ethnic group are similar to each other in more than just accidental features, we realize that we are fundamentally different from other people by that same token. Second, Benoist's economic doctrine is hard to parse. He seems deliberately vague on the question of economic organization. He dedicated most of the populist moment to a critique of the logic of capitalist markets, and the book Against Liberalism was almost entirely about this subject. He alternates between raising pre-modern economies and values up as a counterweight to liberal markets and presenting socialist alternatives as a sign of genuine anti-capitalism. But he is rather silent on the nature of pre-modern markets, which, after all, are still markets. As such, it's difficult to discern where Benoist stands on the question of private ownership versus socialization. He agrees with socialists insofar as he believes that alienation from the producer constitutes a serious problem, and states that in pre-modern economies, men tended to see their products as use values more than as exchange values. But he also argues for hierarchy, and hierarchy implies some form of ownership, and as soon as we have private ownership, we have a market. Moreover, he presented a revision of Marx called critical value theory at the end of both books, indicating that he sees this theory, which critiques the concept of value itself, to be of fundamental importance in his economic vision. A critique of value means fundamentally a critique of markets, since markets are where the exchange of commodities takes place. In the manifesto of the Nouvelle Droit in the year 2000, they speak of decommodification, implying the absence of anything but regional exchange. It's hard to imagine that any decommodified society could possibly be built on the basis of private property. And yet, in the same document, it is implied not that we ought to reject markets, but rather to put the market under considerable state control, such that it does not become the crux of values. All economic life implies the mediation of a large range of cultural institutions and juridical means. Today, the economy must be recontextualized within life, society, politics, and ethics. Between intense criticism of the market as a concept and the rejection of exchange value as a basis for an economy, it's not clear if Benoist would agree to a strictly regulated market society. Benoist, in other places, emphasizes the importance of the state when he speaks of the model of empire, federation, and subsidiarity. Any socialism, by socialism I mean collectivization of the means of production, carried out under the authority of a state would simply result in state capitalism, which Benoist sees as the fundamental failure of what he calls exoteric Marxism. This then only leaves the regulated market society, but one could argue that even a regulated market tends to spread the logic of the market to the rest of society through the influence of the merchants and of value. Benoist has already dismissed the possibility of national markets, and so he would have to conclude that for a market society to not devolve into the values of capitalism, it would have to be absent of merchants, an absurdity. By criticizing modern society on the grounds of markets qua markets through the arguments of Jean-Claude Michéa, we have left behind only socialism, which under Benoist's schema is impossible. The only logical recourse we have, if we consider Michéa's arguments, is to either reject the rejection of markets, and thus reject the criticism that the logic intrinsic to all markets has a morally hegemonic value on society, or to reject the notion of empire and instead argue for a communitarian socialism, like Jean-Claude Michéa does. Any compromise would cause the notion of value to take some sort of hold in the societal hierarchy, at which point we can only appeal to an attempt to minimize the role of the economy and provide alternative and prior values to the market in the hope that it will serve as a prophylaxis and confine value to simply the market space. This chimerical option appears to be the solution generally adopted by the Nouvelle Droit, which brings to mind Evola's notion that the economy must be subordinated by the state. This must be, then, a partial repudiation of Michéa and of critical value theory in favor of a recontextualization of value rather than its elimination. We then also have the question of industry, another subject that remains unclear to me. It's worth noting that most of Benoist's writings are untranslated, and so we only have a minimal view into his ideas, but Benoist several times denounces mass consumption and the logic of progressivist production, a dual critique of liberalism and Marxism under critical value theory. We are left with the inference that Benoist is against industrialism. I personally used to draw some influence from primitivists like Ted Kaczynski, and I adopted more or less a reactionary view of economics from reading Evola. But I realized that this position, that we should return to the actual form of the pre-modern economy, is seriously quixotic. The modern world is geopolitically competitive, and the strength of a state's military is directly tied to its economic output. A pre-modern economy would be unable to produce the modern materiel required to wage modern wars, and as such, it would be easily conquered by liberal states, who, as Benoist has argued, do not hesitate to wage preemptive wars on behalf of human rights. The field of economics is the one place where we cannot afford to adopt abstract critiques based entirely on principles. By necessity, it must involve compromise and pragmatism. Benoist would reject my argument on the basis that it's basically liberal logic, but what alternative do we have? Should we accept a state that is so militarily weak that it cannot defend itself? Besides, the Nouvelle Droit is not a stranger to economic compromise. As I've illustrated already, despite rejecting the market on principle, they accept it as a necessary consequence of hierarchy. Their position on the market is itself a compromise, so why can we not compromise on industry? The central problem of industry is mass production, which creates mass markets, driving an indefinite cycle of production and consumption. One can easily imagine solutions to this problem. These involve incorporating businesses into guilds and then restricting the markets for each business to specific regional areas. Interregional exchange might be available only to the state for the purpose of military production, in which case it would not result in the spread of a system of mass consumption to the rest of the economy. In this way, we can accept what is necessary to be geopolitically competitive, while simultaneously attenuating any effects this might have on communities. The only problem with my view is that it violates the principle of subsidiarity, i.e. that regions ought to have local control over their own economic and political matters. But again, economics, since it's a field that heavily involves praxis, must be a realm of compromise. Lastly, we have to acknowledge the problem of the paganism of Benoist and the Nouvelle Droit. Benoist is very critical of Christianity because he sees in its doctrines the origin of individualism and pluralism. It's certainly possible to see in the Augustinian attitude a prefiguration of these things, but that such doctrines have come through Christianity is not special. If Hellenism became dominant instead, we could have seen the emergence of similar doctrines. The idea that the supernal world has a superior value and right to the material world is not only a Christian concept. We find this in Plato and Aristotle with their theories of form and soul. We have to note that the point of origin for Aquinas' argument that the soul has a natural dignity is Aristotle's body-soul dualism, in which the soul, because it is a reflection of divine nature, exists higher on a value hierarchy with respect to the body. To blame Christianity solely for the doctrine of the universal dignity of the soul is implicitly to condemn Aristotle. The cosmos was always conceived of as greater in importance than the earth, and simultaneously the doctrine of the sacred interiority of man expressed by Augustine, in which Benoist sees the origins of individualism, was present also in classical Greece. Plato believed that the philosopher had to quote-unquote die to be a lover of wisdom, and by that he meant the initiatic death which opens one to intellectual intuition. The concept of intellectual intuition itself, as well as the concept of anamnesis, which is a remembering of the eternal spiritual knowledge which is inside of oneself, are doctrines of sacred interiority. Even in Plato's first Alcibiades, we see the prioritization of the value of the soul over the body. Note also the Delphic exhortation, know thyself. I must also mention the famous mysteries which were associated with an inner initiation. Ironically, despite viewing paganism as a spiritual orientation, Benoist reduces it to its most vulgar, modern, and pantheistic form of pure immanence without transcendence. It is not lost on me that this might have a specifically political motive. I also have to mention the integral traditionalist critique of modern paganism. Historical paganism, according to René Guénon, was a valid revealed tradition. However, after it was displaced by Christianity, its human connection and transmission has been completely lost. All that remains of pagan spirituality, according to Guénon, are psychic residues that are usually of a demoniacal sort, the mere degraded and magical dregs of what was once a true tradition. As such, to practice paganism today is to expose oneself to a number of serious errors and dangers. It is probable that it is not possible to establish a genuine spiritual connection to pagan deities anymore, and numerous intermediary beings are probably quite happy to substitute themselves for Saturn or Jupiter. What else remains of paganism simply consists of magical practices, now disconnected from any integral initiatic order. According to Guénon, it is necessary for the initiate to be connected to an initiatic center, which consists of an order that practices the human transmission of spiritual forces, or theurgy. It is not possible in his view to have an irregular initiation, or one not tied to a living center. Since all of the centers for pagan initiation are long dead, paganism is itself a dead tradition and thus without spiritual possibilities. It remains only a zone for the manipulation of psychic energies, which in no way are spiritual, even though they can produce experiences that appear spiritual. Guillaume Maffei also took issue with the Nouvelle Joyeuse paganism. He thought it marginalized the movement and made it impossible for it to appeal to a Christian Europe. In that regard, I agree entirely. It is simply not practical to promote a pagan critique of Christianity if one wishes to appeal to Europeans. Whether we accept it as ethnic patrimony or not, it remains to be said that Christianity is, today, the one religion characteristic of Europeans. If we want to establish the kind of communitarianism that Benoist recommends, we would have to accept that most communities would be Christian and would probably reject allegiance to a neo-pagan empire. Even Julius Evola, who wrote in his youth a book called Pagan Imperialism, eventually had to reconcile himself with the fact that Christianity is the only tradition European people have left. Those who genuinely care about tradition enough to care about it for its own sake, rather than to create political idols out of it, have to acknowledge that Christianity constitutes the spiritual limit for European countermodernity. The important takeaways from Benoist, I think, are manifold. First, that it is important to consider not just the ethnic makeup of a state, but rather the internal composition of its elements. The fascist idea where society is just a giant homogeneous ethnic bloc is very brittle and inhuman because it does not allow room for internal diversity to express itself. Communitarianism solves this problem decisively. We admit also, along with Benoist, that diversity is a central value of the right, in contrast with the left and its ideology of sameness. Benoist's thesis that equality is opposed to diversity is important as well. Second, democracy, properly understood in its classical sense and its full association with community and citizenship, is not necessarily the dissolutive principle that authors like Guénon and Evola think it is. Traditional democracy was capable of preserving traditional values, at least in its time, because it was localized and based on holistic groups. There is a difference between liberal mass democracy and democracy proper. It's also worth noting that almost all societies have had democratic elements. There were elective kingships and elective monarchies. There have been so-called absolute monarchies that have regional democratic rule, like the Ancien regime. If Alexis de Tocqueville is correct, then these local village and town democracies were essential to the stability of the monarchy. Any advocate for pure and simple absolutism is doing himself a disservice by rejecting out of hand any democratic elements as if they were synonymous with the revolution. Third, liberalism is characterized most of all not by self-government, liberty, nor even fraternity. These principles can actually be reinterpreted in a favorable direction to the right, and we often see that liberals tend to dismiss the concept of self-rule, and they often trample on liberty. Instead, what constitutes liberalism is the logic of the market based on individualism and the axiological neutrality of the state's values, meant to preserve the freedom of self-interested individuals. Liberalism reduces everything to transactional logic based on value, and it is value itself which is the problem, which is why Marxists become allied with capital. They do not want to dispense with the notion of value. As such, modern leftism can more accurately be seen as the victory of liberalism as the status quo. Leftists today are not actually revolutionary, and liberalism has become the predominant logic. Leftism has been swallowed by the market. Fourth, perhaps the most important idea of Benoist, is differentialism. The justification of ethnic blocs on the basis of difference serves as a good counter-argument to the leftist claim that nations are based on hate and domination. This view that particularism ought to be a universal concept is growing in popularity. Keith Woods is probably the most vocal exponent of it, along with Jared Taylor and Greg Johnson. It proves that nationalism and racial consciousness do not have to be the fathers of genocide. Differentialism constitutes a break with the ethnic nationalism of the 20th century, which was based on ideas of purity and supremacy. Instead, differentialism is founded on difference, discreteness, and remains more or less culturally and racially relative. Fifth, Benoist argues that the political divide which is of most importance today is not left versus right, but rather the populace against the elite. The elite have solidified into a consensus on markets, globalization, and pluralism. Trusting the elite to solve our problems is a road to defeat. Instead, what is necessary as political praxis is to endeavor to grant the populace direct control over the political process. We can argue about what the end of this should be. The left would argue that this should produce socialism, and the right would argue that this should produce dictatorship, republic, or monarchy. But whatever the purpose is, the first fundamental step is to restore power and decision to the people. This is the meaning of populism. Benoist agrees more or less with Christopher Lasch's insight in The Revolt of the Elites that the problem with modern elites isn't so much that they have become proletarianized, as Jose Ortega y Gasset argued, but rather that their interests and beliefs have diverged intractably from the populace. It is by restoring power to the people that modern political movements can overcome today's destructive policies.